Today, on Burma Living, I'm joined by Dr. Jason Karlawish. Dr. Jason Karlawish is a professor of medicine, medical ethics, and health policy, and neurology at the University of Pennsylvania. He researches and writes about issues at the intersections of bioethics, aging, and neurosciences. He's also the author of multiple books about Alzheimer's and a writer for the New York Times and other publications. His work has led to widespread acclaim in his field. So I'm excited to learn today from all of his varied experiences and specialties. Dr. Karlawish, thank you so much for being with me today in Burma Living.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here, Han.
Great, thank you. You know, it seems like 100 years or so ago, people didn't die of the Alzheimer's as often, whereas at the end of the 20th century, it was much more common. What happened there? Was it just underdiagnosis, or was there something else at play?
Even more fundamental than underdiagnosis, no diagnosis, because Alzheimer's really wasn't recognized as a disease until about, frankly, I'll put a date on it, 1980. But let me qualify that. The disease was recognized in the early 20th century by the physician whose name is Dr. Alzheimer's. His name was Alois Alzheimer's. And in the book, I recount how he and his other German colleagues were studying persons who had dementia, persons who were old, that is to say over 60, 65, 70, but also some rare cases, unusual cases of persons who were under 60. And at that time in the early 20th century, if you had dementia and you were old, over 65, 70, 80, they said that your dementia was senility. And that senility meant it was an extreme stage of just aging, a confluence of a host of things, but not a disease, not caused by pathology. In contrast, the rare cases of dementia, individuals who were in their 50s, they were thought to have some sort of disease. The bottom line is what Alois Alzheimer's and his colleagues did, and I recount this in the book, The Problem of Alzheimer's, they began to look closely at the autopsies of the brains of both their young people, 50s, young, and their older individuals. And they began to see was there's this common pathologies within these two brains. And the conclusion that they were reaching around 1911, 1912 was maybe the persons with senility aren't extreme aging. Maybe there's actually a disease going on, just like the young people who can't have senile dementia because they're not aging yet. They're not old. And that was really revolutionary work. And again, just to remind you, 1910, 1911, 1912, that's when they were doing this work. Well, what of course happened was 1914. In 1914, Germany fell apart with the World War and the events to follow. Anyway, things disappeared for a while, namely a study of dementia in older adults because of what happened in Germany, because all this work was happening in Germany. It was very German work. But in the late 20th century, a host of events that I recount in the book in culture and science converged to say these older adults who have senility, that's not extreme aging, that's a disease. And we think it's this Alzheimer's disease that we always thought was just a rare disease. And so it's a fascinating story that occurs around about 1976 to 1980 when science and culture converge and redefine dementia in an older adult, not as senility, extreme aging, nothing you can do about it, nothing medicine can do about it, but instead they say, no, this is a disease. And if it's a disease, that means doctors should diagnose it, they should treat it, and the researchers should study it to figure out better ways to diagnose it and to treat it. And that all didn't start until about 1980, mostly in America, but also in the United Kingdom. But America really, in the beginning, led that charge.
Now, if you could go back 100 years, what would you do to educate people about Alzheimer's to prevent us from being in a place where we are today?
A lot of that conversation would have been not with the scientists or the physicians, but with the public and the politicians. Because as I said, Alois Alzheimer's was German. He and his colleagues who did this research, they were all German. They were German nationals or German speaking. They worked out of German universities and asylums. And I keep on bringing that up because that kind of work wasn't going on in France, etc., England, certainly not the United States. But anyway, Germany fell apart because of political issues. And it really fell apart. War, economic collapse, vicious nationalism, vicious anti-Semitism, National Socialism, etc. And so I guess my message would be, pay very close attention, if we could have gone back 100 years, that the things you're doing in society are going to ramify into other things that you don't realize, namely the ability to take care of older adults who have disabling cognitive impairments, for example. So the lesson to contemporary times is be very mindful about the way you run your society and your politics and the wars you fight and the economic system you create, because it can ramify into things like the kind of care you're able to deliver people or, as it were, not deliver people. And so I think while those lessons about Imperial Germany seem just like history, well, there's no empire now in Germany or America, but the political events in Germany are very instructive. The political events in the early 20th century are very instructive to even now about how politics can turn a disease into a crisis. And in the case of Alzheimer's, it is politics that have turned this disease into a crisis.
Mm. I understand that nowadays Alzheimer's can be diagnosed earlier than ever, sometimes even before a person has any memory problems. So, what enabled this advancement?
Yeah, so the one of the stories I tell in the book, in the first part of the book, at part one of the four parts, called Alzheimer's Unbound, it's a fascinating story of beginning in the 80s and really picking up at the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 21st century, of science redefining the way we think about what is Alzheimer's disease, more particularly who is a patient with Alzheimer's disease. So, for example, when I trained in the late 90s into the early aughts, in order to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, I had to make another diagnosis first. And that diagnosis was the diagnosis of dementia, meaning I had to say that someone had disabling cognitive impairments, meaning they had troubles with memory, attention, concentration, and those problems were causing them difficulties doing daily tasks. So, what I'm trying to say is if you didn't have dementia, you couldn't be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Well, that's all changed. And I talk about how there were two discoveries that transformed the way we think about a patient with Alzheimer's disease. One of those was the discovery of this syndrome called mild cognitive impairment by researchers at the Mayo Clinic. And this describes the state of cognitive impairment that causes inefficiencies with daily activities. The person's not disabled, they're just inefficient. But it's a risk factor they found for developing dementia. And so that meant that you could begin to think about diagnosing Alzheimer's not when someone had dementia, but when they had mild cognitive impairment. The second big event, which was truly revolutionary, was the ability to measure the pathologies of Alzheimer's disease, not in a deceased person, but in a living person. And of all the diseases of the body, brain diseases are very difficult to visualize. If you've got a disease in the liver or other organs, you can do an endoscopy or a biopsy, etc. We don't biopsy the brain except in certain rare kind of clinical problems. And so for years, you could not see Alzheimer's until you got the brain out of the skull, which meant, of course, someone had to die. But I talk about researchers who, around the 2000s, announced the results of studies they did that could visualize the pathologies in the brain of a living human. And so that takes us now to 2021, where you're right. We can see the pathologies of Alzheimer's disease unfolding in a brain. And we can see that in a person who has dementia. We can see it in someone who has mild cognitive impairment. And we're able to see it as well in someone who has no cognitive impairment, but perhaps just a bit of symptoms at most. And so you're right. The future is the ability to detect the disease even before someone has dementia, mild cognitive impairment. And that's a very promising future because, of course, if you then had a treatment to give someone, you could slow down the progression of the disease. You could delay the time before someone develops dementia, for example.
As we age, there will be more people with dementia than ever before. Now, are there things we can do now to prepare for the future increase in cases of dementia?
So, as individuals, there are things we can do, and also as a society, there are things that we can do. As individuals, I think it's smart to live with the understanding that there's going to come a time when you're going to have some amount of disabling cognitive problems. It might not be because of Alzheimer's, it might be because of vascular disease or another disease. It might be because of a host of different events in your life that affect your brain health. But my point is the notion that you're going to live without any cognitive impairments into your 80s and 90s. It may happen, and there are certainly people who live into their 90s who are essentially cognitively unimpaired. But the prevalence of cognitive impairment after the age of 80 is about 20%. That's pretty high. And so what should people do? I think what they need to think about is how, if I am developing cognitive problems, will they be detected? And once they're detected, what will I do? And I think that gets to issues of creating a network of people around you who can watch over, look after you, and if you start to develop problems, can intervene. And it gets to very personal aspects of life, like you have to start thinking about this happening with your finances. Who's going to watch over to make sure if I'm making mistakes with my finances, it doesn't cost me money. I don't lose money. I don't get defrauded. I don't get exploited by people. That's just one example of one particular activity, but it's an important one to bring up because financial problems are some of the earliest problems people have. So in summary, for individuals, I really think there's a logic and role for planning around how you're going to deal with loss of cognition, mild though it may be. It has nothing to do with planning for the end of life. It actually has to do with planning for sort of the loss of the ability to self-determine one's life, not the end of life, but the loss of the ability to self-determine one's life.
It's a tough one. It's tough to bring it up. It's tough to talk about it among family members. And I think it's great just what you're doing.
We need a system of long-term care services and support. And then within that system, we need to invest in the kind of services people need, like adult day activity programs. They're out there, but they're not as many, and they're not well resourced, and they need to be resourced and integrated into healthcare systems the same way that we have surgery centers integrated into healthcare systems. And then finally, we can use technology right now to better monitor our brains for cognitive problems and detect problems as they arise. We can do that in the workforce. We can do that in the home, such that we're not waiting for a disaster to happen. So memory centers, national long-term care social insurance, improve the quality of long-term care services and supports like adult day activity programs, and use technology to detect cognitive impairment, and when it occurs, be able to intervene early. Those are the things we can do right now. We just have to muster the political will to do them.
Yeah, I concur with that. And I know there's some in progress, but it needs to be exponentially full force out there. So now I know there's such negative stigma around memory loss and dementia. What is the effect on this stigma on people with dementia and their families? What do you think?
So stigma takes two forms, self-stigma and public stigma. So we'll start with the second one. Public stigma is when other people learn something about someone, and after they learn that, they think less of them. They distance themselves from those people. They assume negative attributes to them. They expand their perception of how impaired the person is, so that they're more impaired than they are. So that's public stigma. And you see that played out in the lives of persons living with dementia and their family members, that their friends and family disappear and they feel isolated. Self-stigma is when you yourself feel distance from others because of something about you. And you may even, for example, choose not to tell people about something because you fear that if they learn it, they're going to practice public stigma. Self-stigma also takes the form of people feeling a threat to their ability to do things. Once they are labeled with something, they feel, well, now I can't do something, and they question their abilities. They doubt their skills. And in this problem of dementia, whether it's been caused by Alzheimer's or other diseases, stigma haunts the lives of patients and their caregivers. The distancing, the feelings of inadequacy, those are all byproducts of stigma.
Do you think ageism plays a role in these stigmas too, or do you think they are two separate issues?
Well, they're hidebound, I would say, no question, that the stigmas that surround dementia are hidebound with the stigmas that surround the perception of the abilities and worth of individuals who are older. Yes.
I guess, what do you think we could do to help break down these stereotypes, both at a personal level and as well as more cultural level?
Yeah, we talked about this a bit already when you and I were chatting before the show, which was, let's start with the cultural level. Let's think about the words and images we use to talk about dementia. A very common set of words and images that's often used to talk about dementia is, and I'll use them not because I like them and use them myself, but just for illustrative points: death before death, the living death, one becomes a zombie, or you die in mind before body. There's a host of lines and expressions around, frankly, death that contribute to those cultural tropes that create the stigma. Another source of stigma is the words we use to describe dementia. Up until a few years ago, it was not uncommon amongst myself and my colleagues that we would talk about someone as being demented. We would say, adjectively, we would say, oh, he's demented. And we don't say that, actually. It's interesting at meetings and talking with my colleagues, we're very explicit with talking about persons living with dementia. We will say, oh, he's a person living with dementia, or as a person living with dementia. So what you're trying to do is separate the diagnosis from your sort of perception of the entire person. So that language shift is very important. So those are some things we can do in culture. I think as individuals, one thing we can do, which is what some of my patients, for example, have done, has been more open with talking about their cognitive problems. I have a patient who was a sports writer here in Philadelphia, a very popular sports writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And he ultimately started writing columns not about sports, but about having Alzheimer's disease. And he would become very well known for that. So I have a patient who was a sports writer, Bill Lyons, and he was famous in Philadelphia for his sports writing. He also then became famous for writing about his Alzheimer's disease. And Bill Lyons was a real hero. He wrote very moving, vivid columns about his experience having Alzheimer's disease. And it's that kind of candor and openness of an individual with the disease and his family to talk about it that does a lot to break down the stigma and to humanize the experience of having the disease.
It's true. It's true. I've been blessed enough to have spoken with some folks living with dementia. I think we just need more folks like that to speak out. We just need more of a voice to show that there is life with dementia. And we just do the very best that we can as our cognition declines. But we're not looking at the decline, but we're looking at celebrating life along the way at whatever capacity that we can. And I think it's so important. And of course, I didn't know this until I passed the hurdle. We're at the later part now. But I think it's so important to not only, how should I say, be saddened by the fact that you can't verbally communicate so much, but it's just the fact that you're there. Be present in the moment. It's your and your loved one's disposition. And just read their temperament. It could be they just want you present, or they want to listen to music or sing even. Pick up on those cues. Because I think too much, myself included, we look at the loss right away. We just, oh, what happened? Because we're looking at them where they are now, where they used to be. But we really need to embrace it at the moment and look forward to many things ahead of life. And there still is a lot of life.
Implicit in what you're saying is a very important point, that the experience of being a caregiver is very contingent on the nature of the relationship you have with the person going into that. And I think that's a very important point for why we really need and value family caregivers, because of the relationship they've had with the person before they develop the cognitive impairments.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's a tough role. Okay, so I'm going to shift gear. We're going to talk about the Biogen's new drug. So what are your thoughts about that new drug? I guess what are the benefits and downside of this drug?
Well, my thoughts about aducanumab is it's a promising drug that needs more study to show if, in fact, it's an effective drug. It's a promising drug. And up until earlier this month of June, I was of the view it needed more study. Unfortunately, the FDA decided it should be available for prescription. I have no objection that someday it may be prescribed and should be prescribed, but I didn't think the data were adequate now to prescribe it. So we're in a bit of a bind now as a country. We have a drug available for prescription that does lower amyloid in the brain, which is one of the pathologies that causes Alzheimer's. That's been well documented. But whether that translates into a benefit to an individual, I think was not yet well established. And many of my colleagues share that view. The FDA didn't see it that way, and they approved the drug, although they recognized that the data were still uncertain. And so they're actually requiring an additional clinical trial to be done by Biogen, the owner of the drug, to verify whether lowering amyloid actually translates into a clinical benefit. There's a number of challenges to doing that. But my point is, we are making progress with developing therapies for persons living with Alzheimer's disease. And aducanumab was one example of that progress. There are other drugs. Unfortunately, this decision by the FDA to allow the company to start marketing the drug and selling it is frankly premature. And so that's the bind that we're in right now as a country based on that FDA decision.
So why do you think some people are confused by the moral aspects of Alzheimer's medication? We have medication that is approved, and it's not fully gone through the clinical trials with all the necessary supporting data.
Mhm.
There's a moral issue to this. That
Yeah,
happened.
so
Why are people
well,
confused?
the FDA used regulations that were written back in the AIDS era that allowed what was called accelerated approval of a drug based on its effect on a measure of the biology of the disease, with still not clear evidence that the disease, that evidence translates into clinical effect. And that's the regulations they used. Their argument was that it's a serious disease. There's no existing therapies. All that is true. But again, and without getting into insider baseball, I think many in the field feel that the claim that amyloid is an effective surrogate reduction of amyloid is just premature and needed more study. I think that the rhetoric that surrounded the morals of this decision, because it was ultimately an ethical decision by FDA, is one of, they say, well, people are desperate and they need hope. And that's certainly been a very common set of hidebound emotions people talk about. The problem that I have with the decision is I agree people are desperate and I agree they need hope, but I think that this decision undermines another emotion, which is trust, namely trust in the system for review and approval of drugs. So I guess we're in a very difficult conversation right now as a country around how do we satiate the desperation and provide hope while still maintaining trust in the system. And I think the events of the last few weeks with this FDA decision have created a very difficult set of conversations in that space.
So, if the efficacy of this drug isn't backed up, let's say by 40% in clinical trials, what are your thoughts on the future success as an Alzheimer's medication?
I think this particular drug is going to have a very interesting history because the company is required to do some sort of study to actually validate its benefits. How they're going to do that's going to be a challenge because the drug's also available for prescription. There are ways you can do that kind of study. It's complicated. Having said that, I think there's some concerns that persons who are willing to be in other research studies might not drop out of those studies and instead take this drug because it's available instead of being in a clinical trial. We'll see in the next several months, next 12 months, we'll see what happens with those other studies. Do they lose their subjects to the drug? Do they fail to fill up with enough subjects? That'll be a very interesting, very important piece of data to gather in America, and we should learn from that and listen to that. But there are other drugs under study. The last several years actually has been I recognize that one of the common rhetorical points to support the approval of aducanumab is that there's been no new drug in the last 20 years. That's absolutely correct. I completely agree. There's no disputing that fact. But the last 5 years have seen a lot of progress in being able to better design and conduct studies to show whether, in fact, the drug works. And so I recognize the desperation waiting 20 years, but I just felt that we were just on the edge of success here. And this approval, I beg to differ with those who say it will spur innovation. I think it actually may thwart innovation. And we'll see over the next 12 to 24 months which of those two perspectives is correct.
So, now what are some ways to improve Alzheimer's disease treatment today without using drugs like Biogen's drug, returning to old treatments such as HRT or Donepezil?
Donepezil has been well studied and well used. And I think everyone agrees that the benefits of the cholinesterase inhibitors are mild at best and not sustained. Now, that's the judgment even of NIA and program announcements they've issued to try and to support research to discover new treatments. I think the cholinesterase inhibitors, Donepezil being one of them, are an important lesson for us. And we desperately want a treatment. Those were available, and we really promoted them. They helped to build a scientific infrastructure to do the research that made aducanumab and other drugs possible. And so that was a good thing. I think one of the key things that I think we ought to listen to is many of the studies that were done in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years in persons with Alzheimer's disease, actually it turns out probably about a third of the persons didn't have Alzheimer's disease. They didn't have the pathologies. They had dementia. But they probably didn't have the pathologies that cause Alzheimer's. They had other diseases. And I think that's an important point because there's probably some drugs out there that we studied that failed, that if we studied them again using the tests we have now to identify whether someone actually has the pathology of Alzheimer's disease, we might actually find that the drug actually is successful. So that's an area of research that I think might need to be revisited, given that we can now determine in your own brain that you have amyloid and that you have tau, the two pathologies that cause Alzheimer's. And we couldn't do that with great confidence until about 5 years ago.
hmm I'll tell you, I was excited to see all the clinical trials and the innovations. And I think what you just said about since it's FDA approved, the big issue now, I think, is trust,
Hmm.
um, because what what's going to happen later on if they approve it another one or more data is shown there's problems or deaths resulting from this drug?
There are legitimate concerns that the process FDA used to approve aducanumab sets a new bar for approval that, if repeated, could start to really introduce a set of drugs into the practice that we're really not confident are helpful. And for a disease as vast and all encompassing as Alzheimer's disease is, that has huge public health consequences. Senator Manchin of West Virginia wrote a letter to President Biden where is worried. In that letter, he expresses his concern about this approval and specifically cites this drug and the process for its approval and pleads for a restoration of the kind of processes that FDA used to use, namely listening to its advisory boards. This is resonating in the political sphere now.
So today we live and create our identities and social media sites like Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. It means that everything is accessible online and your identity, your vulnerability, and so forth. So, what do you think the implications for our sense of determination in a society like this?
Well, we certainly have made ourselves more interconnected in ways that are unprecedented and undermine some of our privacy and put our identity out for all to see. In the case, therefore, of persons living with early stages of cognitive impairment, this is interesting because, of course, what you're doing is putting out there clues and signals that you might be developing cognitive impairment. And you're also trusting the system that it's going to respect your privacy and your identity as you develop cognitive impairment. So this gets back to sort of the downside of monitoring. The downside of the system watching over you is now what was private is now potentially quite public. And so I think there's great promise for technology to monitor people, but there's also peril to a loss of identity and a loss of privacy that will come, and therefore a loss of identity because of the loss of privacy. So those are real challenges we're going to need to face.
Do you have anything else that you would like to add?
It's a journey of writing to do this book, and there were several kind of fundamental lessons I walked away from, and I'll give you two. One is that the problem of dementia, whether it's caused by Alzheimer's or Lewy body disease or frontotemporal lobar disease or vascular disease, the problem of dementia is a very unique problem because early and relentlessly, what dementia means is you're losing your ability to self-determine your life. And that's a cherished value, but a hard-won and hard-fought value that we only really universally enjoyed until the mid of the 20th century. So in that sense, this is a very modern problem and reflecting a very important modern value, namely the ability to self-determine your life. But related to that is, I think dementia reveals how we're interconnected. This is in some sense a disease of humanity. And it forces us to recognize, yes, we're losing our ability to self-determine, but it reveals how interconnected we are when we are self-determining our lives. And so I kind of have a cautious optimism that we can see this as a humanitarian problem and tackle it as one. We're not going to drug our way out of each and every single disease that causes dementia. Think about cancer. We've made great progress in cancer. Some cancers are curable. They're certainly treatable, but people still do die of cancer or suffer great disability. So I think we have to have that kind of attitude around this problem of dementia caused by Alzheimer's and other diseases. We will make great progress, but we have to see it as not simply something that will be solved by drugs, but drugs will be part of the equation, but they're not going to be the entire solution. And if we can do that, I think we can learn to live well with dementia. I'm not trying to say it will be fun. All disease is bad, but I think we can learn how to live well with it.
Great. Now, where can listeners find you and find your book?
Listeners can learn more about me by visiting my website, jasonkarlawish.com. And my book, The Problem of Alzheimer's, How Science, Culture, and Politics Turned a Rare Disease into a Crisis, and What We Can Do About It, is available basically wherever you can get books. There's all the online sites, IndieBound, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, etc., and then stores. I've popped into a few Barnes & Nobles. I was in New York over the weekend in Manhattan, and I walked into Barnes, and they had a bunch of copies. I signed them. So if you're on Barnes & Noble on Fifth Avenue, you can pick up a signed copy. It's available as an ebook in addition to hardback, and a really nice audiobook as well. A very good actor read it. And I think he did a great job.
Great. So I'll make sure to include the links and the show notes as well.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care.